Kia ora and welcome to Context. I'm Corin Dan.
And I'm Guy Espiner, and in case you are new to Context, it is the backstory to the front page story, where we take an issue that's making news today and we trace the long shadow of that and figure out how we got to where we are today.
There's a twist, of course, and the twist is only one of us knows what the topic's going to be each week, and that just sort of keeps things a little bit interesting and spicy. And if you don't believe me, just look at this. I'm the one holding the notes. Diane's the one who doesn't have the notes this week because it's my turn.
That's right. I've had people actually, Corin, saying, "Is it true? Do you really not know what the other person's going to talk about?" And yes, it is. I've got no idea. So why don't you put me out of my misery, Corin, and tell me, What are you going to drop on me today?
I'm going to drop on you New Zealand at the United Nations.
Oh my God.
Which is a really interesting story. A proud story, one that you can't help but be a little proud of. We've got a rich history and one which is right in the news right now because probably around the last week of September, New Zealand, and it'll be Winston Peters actually, not necessarily, not Christopher Luxon, which in itself was a little bit interesting. I might ask you about that in a second. Will go to the United Nations General Assembly. It's the 80th General Assembly. And he will most likely, and I say most likely because it's not confirmed, spell out whether New Zealand is going to recognise Palestine as a state. Now, a number of our allies have pretty much said they are going to, bar a few conditions, but pretty much the likes of Australia, the UK, I think Canada, France have indicated they're going to do it. Now, New Zealand seems likely to do it. Let's have a listen to Christopher Luxon when he announced that they were probably going to do it.
We acknowledge that some of our close partners have and others haven't taken a position to formally recognise Palestine. It's a formal decision that Cabinet will take in September, and frankly, it's something that the Minister of Foreign Affairs will articulate when he's at the Leaders' Week in the UN at the end of September.
I mean, firstly, Guy, are you surprised that Christopher Luxon's not doing that? I mean, in the past, Prime Ministers have gone, I would have thought he would have, but it seems as though Winston's got that job.
Yeah, I mean, if it was a Helen Clark-led government, you would be struggling to keep her away, wouldn't you? So, I mean, she was someone who took the attitude that the Prime Minister was kind of also the de facto Foreign Minister. But you've got a guy in Winston Peters, this is his third rodeo, is it, as Foreign Minister? And, he's jealously guarding that position. So I suppose in those dynamics, it possibly isn't a surprise. Christopher Luxon has a different style of leadership, doesn't he? He delegates a lot more than a Key or a Clark might have done. So I guess in that context, it's perhaps not surprising.
And we don't know 100% that New Zealand is going to come out and say that it supports the idea of Palestine being a state. Now, the position has always been, Winston Peters has always said it's going to happen, it's just a matter of when. So it seemed a bit odd when they came out and said this, that they were going to take another month to consider it. And I think ACT has raised some concerns, and there is criticism that maybe Hamas would benefit from this in some way.
That it was somehow rewarding Hamas to acknowledge Palestine in that way. It did seem that to kick it down the road for a month was to try to smooth over some coalition ructions, do you think? Or do you think it was more time to this?
I've sort of gone out on a limb here because I think I'd be very surprised if we suddenly turned around and said, oh, no, we're not going to. And I think it's important to remember and tell people, I think the reason why we're doing it and why all these other countries are doing it now is to keep the two-state solution alive. And that seems to have been the rationale I've heard, that yes, it's symbolic, and there's a lot of hoops that Palestine would need to jump through to become, a fully fledged state. At the moment, it's an observer status at the UN. It doesn't have full status. 147 countries do recognise Palestine as a state. But I think the argument is that they want to do it because they want to keep the pressure on Israel to keep that two-state solution alive amidst the war in Gaza.
Yes. How much do you think that relations with the US are playing into this? I mean, again, this is a coalition. We've talked about this too before, didn't we, on context when we looked at the FBI and the defence and security relationship with America. I mean, how much do you think we are fearing opprobrium from the US if we go ahead and recognise Palestine? Do you think that that's playing into this?
It's got to be a factor. There's got to be considerations, and I think New Zealand will feel a lot more comfortable moving with the likes of the UK, Australia, Canada and those other Five Eyes nations, and France, I think, is in there as well. Now, let's just give people a little bit of the backstory about what the UN sort of is and how it sort of operates quickly before we get into some of the history involved here. You can help me out on this. I won't make it a pop quiz.
I'm not sure that I can, actually. It's not a strong suit, but I'll give it a crack.
Well, let's talk about, okay, so 80 years old, 1945, and we'll get to the New Zealand elements around that. They established the UN Charter. The United Nations formed. Prior to that, it was the League of Nations.
The League of Nations,
go so well.
yeah. Woodrow Wilson,
yeah, that didn't go so well, did it? So a bunch of countries, 50 of them, come together. They're like, we've got to figure out a way, when there is conflict, when there is war, we've got to figure out a way to stop it. So they come up with this, a big meeting in San Francisco. It took a long time. And they came up with a charter, and countries signed this charter, and it's got a bunch of rules, and it's, you're mandated to. You sign the charter, you're in. And there is let's just go through some of the mechanics of it. So you've got the General Assembly, which meets at the end of September every year. That is every country. Currently, I think it's 193, give or take one or two. It doesn't have a huge amount of power. It's more about, people can bring things forward and discuss and debate and raise ideas. Then there's the Secretariat, or the UN General Secretary, who currently is Antonio Guterres, and they effectively run the bureaucracy of the United Nations. They are a spokesperson. They don't essentially have a lot of power. The power is all in the Security Council, and that is 15 nations, 10 of which are non-permanent, and they rotate over 2-year cycles, divided up around the world into regions. And then there's 5 permanent members, and here is my pop quiz to see if you can tell me the 5 permanent members of the United Nations UN Security Council.
Yeah, I'll probably get this wrong. I could fling around a few of them. Obviously, the United States and China. I presume Russia is still a member of the permanent Security Council. I don't know. Is it UK and France?
Yes, it is. That is your top 5 there. Now that is where we're going to focus probably primarily today with this context, looking at some of the history involved with New Zealand and the Security Council, some really good stuff. But quickly, the UN does so much stuff. Like it's like doing standing orders, trying to have a look. I mean, you think of Helen Clark. She ran the UN Development Agency, which was about development. Then
she was pretty much number 3, wasn't she, in that role?
She was.
Was that about fair? Yeah.
No, absolutely fair. Then it's got a myriad of human rights organisations and treaties and conventions. There's the Climate Change Convention, the COP, that is part of the UN system. WHO, that is part of the UN system. It's massive. But let's just stick to the bit that was designed to stop wars, to stop genocides, to stop people fighting after the trauma of World War II. And I might just see if we can play a little bit of audio here from a New Zealand Prime Minister who was instrumental in the foundation of the United Nations. Here we go.
Under the draft proposals, after a great power by common consent and agreement has been solemnly indicated as an aggressor, obviously nothing further can be done if that power exercises its right of veto. It gets off with it. It is also clear that if the veto is exercised in such a case, defiantly and perhaps even cynically, the faith of men and of nations in the World Organization would collapse.
So, can you have a crack at that?
I'd imagine that's Peter Fraser.
It is.
Is that Peter Fraser? Yeah. Sometime around sort of 47, I suppose. What was it?
1945. So he's speaking at the San Francisco Foundation of the UN there, and he was talking about the thing which has dogged the United Nations and the Security Council, and that is the veto.
The veto power, yeah.
So those 5 permanent members you mentioned earlier, when they established the UN in 1945, they all organised to get a veto so they could block anything. And here's where it's important to mention that the Security Council can do a lot of things. It can all the way through to authorising force. It can back our countries taking force. It can send in peacekeepers. It can do a really range of things. But you have to have 9 and no vetoes in order to do it. And the veto, right then, Peter Fraser knew that veto was going to be a problem, but I think in the end, the founding fathers, as they've called, were like, well, better that we have a system where these powerful nations have a veto than have no system at all. So, I mean, what do you know about Peter Fraser? Because I've actually got his a book here that Michael Bassett and Michael King wrote about him. It's a great book, Tomorrow Comes a Song. I recommend it to some history buffs, if I can bring it up there. There we go. Because he was a great Prime Minister for New Zealand, and these guys, Bassett and Michael King, they actually pretty much say he might be the only Prime Minister at that point when they wrote this that could be considered a genuine statesman. And he really was praised for what he did at the UN.
Yes, and Helen Clark was a great fan of his, wasn't she? And speaks incredibly warmly about him. I knew he had an instrumental role in actually laying some of those foundations for the UN, and obviously an outsized role in New Zealand terms. But I don't actually know a lot about what sort of man he was and what drove him in his politics.
Well, I won't go into too much detail about him, but what I would say is that he went to prison in World War I for speaking out against conscription.
Is that right?
So that gives you an indication. He was certainly... and he went on during and then obviously Savage died in office. And for 1940, Peter Fraser took over as Prime Minister, and the country's at war. He made one big decision, really, which was when the New Zealand forces overseas got an absolute shellacking in Greece, in Crete. He pretty much said to Churchill, right, from now on, we control where New Zealand troops go. We're not going to just be this little appendage of the Commonwealth, and Churchill and his generals can send us off into the meat grinder or whatever. He took control and insisted that New Zealand has the say, as it should have, but we were in a period where we're still becoming an independent country from the UK. So he had an outsized influence there as well. He is widely regarded, not just from New Zealand, but I think within the UN system of his role. And actually, let's move on, but let's just have there's a quick clip here. I think have we got Winston Peters talking about? Let's play that because it still resonates today. This is just a few years ago at the UN.
Fraser was a realist. He understood the Charter was imperfect. From the earliest debates in San Francisco, New Zealand fought against the veto rights bestowed upon the great powers. And though he considered the Charter imperfect, he thought those imperfections could be overcome if the spirit of San Francisco is carried into the operation of the Charter.
There you go. That was Winston Peters. Why not? Why wouldn't you bring up Peter Fraser when you speak at the United Nations?
Absolutely. And it is interesting. I'm just thinking about this, as that was playing. It's no wonder that New Zealand, as a small country, has seen such benefit in this world order, right? And obviously, you're setting it up post-World War II and the utter destruction and devastation of that. But you also, as a small country, you need a rules-based system, Because you are not going to win if it's great power rivalry. And I guess we'll get into some of this as you unfurl
well, I think you're tapping into the
sort
dark
of stuff.
moments in my soul when I'm lying in bed at 3 a.m.
Yeah, I mean, because
you're absolutely right.
Let's
face it.
Yeah.
What is the world we're in at the moment? These world rules, are breaking down, and the UN was already under pressure You know,
Yes.
people were already critical of it.
And in the strongman sort of universe, it becomes a thing of mockery, doesn't it? You know, and you mock the UN and you laugh at it as some sort of woke sort of agenda or sort of globalist agenda. And you are coming into quite a frightening space where, you know, the likes of Russia piling into Ukraine and some of the things that Trump is saying and doing, you do sort of, you worry about that as a small country that, you know, we're the small kid on the playground, right? We need the rules.
Well, absolutely. And you've just got to look at Ukraine and Gaza, and you've got to, if you sort of step back and go, the UN is failing to stop these conflicts. It can't stop them. And arguably because of the power blocks, Russia and the US have veto rights on the UN Security Council. It can't, for example, send in peacekeepers or make a resolution criticising them or doing that, because it wouldn't even take it to the committee because it would know that it's going to be blocked. Let's have a little look at how the world, some major conflicts after World War II, and see how they sort of, New Zealand dealt with them and how the United Nations dealt with them. I think you've been to Korea, haven't you? Let's talk about Korea, because this is a really interesting one. 1950, North Korea invades the South. The United Nations Security Council meets immediately. Resolution 82, I think, demanded withdrawal. 83, recommended the UN provide military assistance. 84, this is Resolution 84, set up a unified command under the US with the UN flag. They sent troops in. It was a UN mission there. So let's have a listen at what to the New Zealand Prime Minister at the time. Pretty excited about sending, well, excited is not the right word, but pretty enthusiastic about sending troops.
And I come here this morning in the name of the government of your country and in the name of all the people to bid you bon voyage, good luck, and a safe return. The people of New Zealand would wish me to say to you that they very greatly appreciate this practical expression of your patriotism by your volunteering for this very important task.
Any ideas who that is? I have to say he's not a Prime Minister I'm that familiar with. But he's served for quite
I'm
a
just
long
trying to
time.
work out who was there, because Nash didn't take over till 57, did he? And so you're somewhere between Fraser and Nash, aren't you? I don't actually know.
Yeah, no, it's Sid Holland. And
Sid
who's
Holland,
not
okay.
a name
Yeah, no,
who
he's
jumps
not.
out at me.
No, he's not.
No, he's not. And he actually served, I think, for 8 years in the
Did
end.
he? Yeah, okay. Yeah,
we sent two
between
frigates.
Fraser and Nash. Did we send 2 frigates to Korea?
Yeah, we sent 2 frigates and 1,000
Wow.
men, and that may have been over the whole course of the initial war. But it was a reasonably significant exercise, and the interesting thing is, technically, it's still going. Isn't it?
Well, that's right. I mean, it actually ended in 53, didn't it? 1953. I went over there in 2003 with Helen Clark. I was working with TVNZ or Sunday Star Times or someone at the time, and so it must have been the 50th anniversary of the so-called end of the war. But yes, technically, it never ended, has it? I remember going up there to that. Have you been up to the DMZ, the demilitarised
No,
zone?
I've been to Korea, but I didn't get to go up there. No.
Yeah, and they blast terrible music at each other, and you know, strange things, and the North tries to tunnel into the South. Famously, Mike Moore said that no one from South Korea, in his defence of capitalism, he said that no one from South Korea tries to tunnel into the North. But yeah, it's quite a thing to behold. The DMZ.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, Korea, and because just a little footnote on that, people might say, well, how did the Security Council agree to send UN forces there? And it's sort of under a US flag, but it's a UN operation. And from my investigation, it seems to be that at that point in 1950, the Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council, so it wasn't there, because it was upset that China was on the Security Council, because it was the nationalist Chinese that were on the Security Council in 1915, not the communist Chinese. So it's a little weird loophole that allowed that to get through the Security Council,
Right,
which is kind of pretty random, which is interesting when you jump forward to the Vietnam War, 1960s, 65. Let's have a listen to Keith Holyoake speaking about sending troops to Vietnam.
The serious situation in South Vietnam has brought home to all New Zealanders just how vitally we are concerned with the events and the issues in the whole of Southeast Asia. Naturally, the issue which is of deepest concern for all of us is whether we should give further military assistance in South Vietnam in its bitter struggle for independence and freedom against this flagrant communist aggression.
So the difference there, Guy, was that the UN, just from what I was looking around, and I couldn't see that the UN barely considered it. It's like, and basically what seems to have happened is by that point, the US and the Soviet Union had formed into their Cold War blocs, and there was no point in the UN considering it because they wouldn't have been able to act because it would have got vetoed. So New Zealand, we went with the US effectively there.
We did, didn't we? And the UK didn't, did they? Interestingly, the UK didn't fight in Vietnam.
No, I'm not actually. You've probably got me there. I didn't actually know that.
Yeah, no, they didn't.
Like
It was apparently the first war that we had when we hadn't aligned up with Britain, and we'd. So this is obviously post ANZUS. We were in that security relationship with the US and Australia. We didn't invoke ANZUS to fight in that war, but we.
Interesting.
Yeah, but we did line up.
It's funny, when we think of our childhoods, and there was a lot of Vietnam War movies.
That's
I'm
right.
thinking Tour of Duty,
Yeah,
Platoon, fantastic movie Platoon. For some reason, it never really occurred to me that New Zealand soldiers were there and engaged, and so were Australian. And looking at this, there's 3,800 New Zealanders served in Vietnam.
What was that number? How many?
3,890 over the period of the time they were there.
Yeah, I think we lost about 500 people, did we? Was it that many?
37 fatalities,
Okay.
187 wounded.
Okay.
So reasonably significant. Yeah, I don't know why. It's funny, isn't it? American
Yeah, we would
culture.
have had our SAS involved there too. I think people like the late Tā Wera Gardner famously fought there. So there was some pretty full on and heroic New Zealand soldiers who fought in that war.
Let's move on to Iraq. A couple of legs to this.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So Gulf War, 1991. Can you remember where you were when that happened? I mean, how old would you? I was.
Yeah, I would have been. I would have been
16, 17.
Yeah, I would have a few years older than you. So 2021. I wouldn't have been. I wouldn't have been in journalism, but I certainly remember it, and because it was the kind of almost the first television
TV.
war, wasn't it?
It
and
was.
CNN and things, you would actually see it.
There was a Kiwi guy there too, wasn't there? What was his
Peter
name?
Arnett, probably was it? Peter Arnett, I think.
Did he come from Invercargill or something?
Yeah,
someone can help us out there.
Yeah.
But he was like in the hotel when the bombs were falling.
Yeah.
So 91 was interesting. It had UN backing to protect, like the US effectively was given the okay by the Security Council that this was an invasion of Kuwait.
Because he'd gone into Kuwait.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
So that was fine. Well, fine-ish. Of course, we know it never got rid of Saddam Hussein, but they pushed them back out of Kuwait. Then things sort of come to a standstill. Fast forward to 2003, we're after 9/11, 2003, and let's have a listen to somebody. You can tell me who this is. You'll know who this is at the UN Security Council, making the case for the US needing to go in and take out Saddam Hussein.
For Saddam Hussein, possession of the world's most deadly weapons is the ultimate trump card, the one he must hold to fulfill his ambition. We know that Saddam Hussein is determined to keep his weapons of mass destruction. He's determined to make more. Given Saddam Hussein's history of aggression, given what we know of his grandiose plans, given what we know of his terrorist associations, and given his determination to exact revenge on those who oppose him, should we take the risk that he will not someday use these weapons at a time and a place and in a manner of his choosing, at a time when the world is in a much weaker position to respond?
Yeah, that'd be Colin Powell, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
Secretary of State, who had to make the case. Of course, the WMDs were never found. I mean, the CIA had sexed up the dossier, and it's terrible. I'm actually reading a book called The Mission by Tim Weiner at the moment. He tracks some of this in the CIA mission in the early 2000s, and that's well worth a read. But he goes into some detail about that and about the shocking level of.
I mean, they
intelligence.
were laughed out of town, basically.
Yeah.
The rest, even their allies, just didn't buy it. and the UN Security Council didn't give them the go-ahead.
Except Tony Blair did, didn't he? And the UK. But look,
Yes.
to New Zealand's credit and to Helen Clark's credit, she didn't buy it at all. I mean, the Aussies were in boots and all too, weren't they? And I guess they had the ANZUS relationship still, although they didn't invoke ANZUS, but they were really tied with the US, and we were really on the outer for not going into that.
Oh, it was a massive call from Helen Clark, wasn't it, at the time? Absolutely massive call. I mean, the US tried to justify it. They tried to say that it was actually the same conflict as 1991, and that
is that right?
They were just well, they didn't have much else, I don't think, to rely on. There is a self-defence clause that can get you around.
So that was the
UN
idea,
Security
wasn't it?
Council.
That it was a preemptive strike. Wasn't that the idea? That was the way it was framed. That he had these weapons and was going to use them, and so they had.
I think
to
Colin
act.
Powell basically, didn't he? I think he called it a blot on his career.
Oh yeah, well he was hung out to dry, really, wasn't he? He had to make the case. But Bush and Cheney had really early on had made the idea that somehow that Saddam Hussein was involved in with Al Qaeda in the 9/11 attacks, which obviously there was no evidence that he was. So they were pretty gung ho from the early after 9/11, weren't they? It was only a matter of time before they were.
I think that was damaging. I think that was damaging for the UN because the US went ahead and did it anyway. And again, it comes back to that problem, and people start to lose confidence in the UN.
Well, it
when
does,
these things
doesn't
happen.
it? Yeah. And then when you try to say, well, you look at Putin going into Ukraine, and then you say, well, you guys have done it, going into Iraq, and it delegitimizes it, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, let's get to another one. So New Zealand has served 4 times on the UN Security Council. And just to remind people, so this is your 10 non-permanent. So there's the 5 permanent, the big guns, and then the other 10 rotate. They have 2-year terms, and they're elected depending on regions within the General Assembly. New Zealand was on in 1954 to 55. Not too much happened that struck me when I looked into that. Maybe we sided with Guatemala once when they got upset with the US, a CIA coup, apparently.
Yeah, there was. That was 54, wasn't it? I was looking at this the other day, weirdly. I do remember that.
Of course you would.
Yeah, of course I was.
I wasn't even going to mention it. I thought it was too obscure.
No, that was.
I wanted to say you're not in Guatemala now.
Because the CIA took out Iran in 53 and Guatemala in 54. So it's because I've been reading this book on
let's go
CIA.
there. Guatemala goes to the Security Council and say, help us. This is what it's for. And then the Americans go, no. We've got some Pan-American Pacific organisation that should be dealing with this particular crisis, not the United Nations. And so they effectively didn't. But New Zealand was not happy about that, and we were more sympathetic to Guatemala and its case, as we should have been as a small nation. But obviously, I don't think it quite paid out the way Guatemala necessarily would have liked it. 66 to 67, we were on the Security Council. It feels to me like we kept our head down because we were also fighting the Vietnam War at the time.
Yes.
But there's 2 big ones, and we need to focus on these a little bit. 93 to 94, we were on this, and this is probably what we infamously and... this is a really hard one. So the crisis that came up in 93-94 was the Rwanda genocide. And New Zealand was heavily involved in this. And I've got to get through this fairly quickly. But actually, let's hear from the UN Secretary-General talking about this and looking back. This was a stain on the United Nations, and New Zealand was involved, can hold its head up high, but not many countries can.
On my first visit to the Kisoji Memorial, I heard and felt the silence of death, the silence of all those lost, and the silence of the international community in your hours of greatest need. Many United Nations personnel and others showed remarkable bravery, but we could have done much more. We should have done much more.
Certainly should have done much more. So there'd been civil war and unrest in Rwanda for many, many years, a lot of colonial issues going on there, a very complicated situation. But effectively, there was a UN force there of some thousands And when New Zealand was holding the presidency of the Security Council, very quickly, that rotates on a monthly basis when you're on there. You get to then set the agenda. So we're like right in the chair. Colin Keating was there. This situation explodes because the president is killed in an air crash, and all of a sudden the Hutu, the militant Hutus, they carry out a genocide on the Tutsi, as well as some of the moderate Hutus, arguably predetermined. When this plane crash happens, it all explodes. Now, at this point, there were UN troops there, but unbelievably, the UN Security Council actually voted to bring most of those back. It was like the message wasn't getting through. Even though the world was watching this genocide, the UN somehow wasn't sort of picking up on how serious it was. Now, Colin Keating, to his credit, was desperately trying to get the key players at the UN to recognise that a genocide had kicked off there, and 800,000 people were massacred in the space of about 10 weeks. It is, obviously one of the most horrific episodes in human history.
Wow, was it that many? Gosh.
Keating was trying, and he, it must be incredibly, must have been incredibly demoralising, but they couldn't get the Security Council to intervene in the way. And the reason why seems to be that the likes of the US, France was heavily involved, in other countries, and I'm skimming over a lot of stuff here, and I'm apologising for that. But it seems to be they had, America had been burned with Somalia, and they'd lost soldiers there a year before. The Belgians had lost a number of peacekeepers who had been killed in Rwanda as well, and there was this attitude of they didn't want to be dealing with Africa, and they didn't want to be dealing with this. So they weren't hearing the pleas that were coming from the aid groups and those who were there saying this has turned into a full-scale genocide. They were acting like it was just a civil war when it was more than that. That'd be my best go at trying to describe that.
Yeah.
Terrible situation.
Yeah. And Don McKinnon would have been the foreign minister, would he, at that point? New Zealand foreign minister?
I'm not entirely sure. He probably would have been.
He would have been, yeah, in those early 90 years in the Bolger government, yeah.
But as I say, from the research I did, it seems pretty clear that Colin Keating, who is our ambassador, now and that's a good point actually, every country has an ambassador based in New York, who, and especially when you're on the Security Council, you can be called there at any minute for an emergency meeting. You got a residence. I've been to one of the residences over the road from the UN, that beautiful building, and he can hold his head up high from what I've read in terms of his efforts to try and stop that genocide. But clearly the UN failed because that's what it's set up to do, and that's been a huge disappointment. Let's jump forward to 2015, 2016. You'll be more familiar with this one. New Zealand campaigns. Murray McCully leads the charge. Let's have a listen to him to get on the Security Council, and they were successful.
We obviously have some strong views about the trouble spots in the world, and particularly the inability of the UN Security Council to find a way of dealing with most of them. I've been fairly critical, and so is the Prime Minister in that respect. So if you're going to criticise, you have to put yourself forward and say, well, we'll help fix this.
Yes, now you'll remember Murray McCully was the Foreign Minister at the time, and John Key was very keen on this as well. And, credit to both of them. They pushed really hard to get New Zealand on that Security Council. They ran a great campaign, and they got on there, and they pushed really hard on things such as Syria. Let's have a quick listen to John Key on Syria too. He was very strong on that issue with ISIS.
We've also been deeply troubled to see the Council, the preeminent body for international peace and security, fail to live up to its responsibilities on the most serious crisis of our time, Syria. Here the Council has fallen short.
So there you go. Yeah, it's interesting actually, isn't it? And perhaps we can squeeze in a couple of war stories here from us, Guy. You went to Afghanistan, didn't you? Which is a slide bar to this story, because it was actually UN sanctioned to a degree. There was a sort of slightly complicated, wasn't it? And I went to Iraq when Key was pushing for New Zealanders to train troops there. So, John Key, you'd have to say, was a pretty active Prime Minister in that regard, and in similar vein to Helen Clark, to be honest.
Yes, and I went actually for TVNZ with John Key into Iraq, and we went into Kabul, into Bamyan, where New Zealand had a provincial reconstruction team. I remember John Key was very, very eager to go, and he obviously wanted the media to come and, and show what he was doing. He wanted to support the SAS troops who had had gone in. Obviously, Helen Clark had sent the SAS in early in 2000, just following 2001, and they had done a few missions. But then John Key wanted to send them back. I think we're looking at 2009, maybe 2010, and he was getting closer with the US too, and he'd gone and sent the SAS back into Afghanistan. So yes, we went over there with him, and we spent a week or something there. You went to Iraq probably with Key as well, did you? Or,
yes, with Key. That was a bit later on when the ISIS situation cropped up, and New Zealand was very strong on fighting and committing New Zealand to that fight against that extreme group ISIS, which was operating in Iraq and Syria. And, so he pushed pretty hard in that regard. But what's interesting from our time on the Security Council in some ways at that period was Israel. And it kind of brings us back full circle in a funny kind of way. You'll be familiar with this too. Resolution 2334. Now, this was a co-sponsored resolution. New Zealand, along with Malaysia, Senegal and Venezuela, we weren't the president of the committee at that stage, the Security Council, I should say, but effectively it was criticising Israel for breaching international law, flagrant breach of international law for its settlements in the likes of the West Bank. Now, normally these wouldn't even get put up, and there's all sorts of haggling behind the scenes on these sort of things at the UN, huge bureaucracy and politics and all that sort of stuff. But the United States abstained, and so it gets put up. And apparently, Murray McCulley was called by Benjamin Netanyahu, so this has been reported, and basically Netanyahu said that there was akin to war, that we would co-sponsor this resolution. Yeah. Do you remember that?
Well, I do. I didn't recollect that it was quite in those quite explicit terms.
As I say, it's reported. It's probably
true.
Though. The reports I've seen.
Yeah, and didn't look. And please correct me if I'm wrong here, but didn't Winston Peters, when becoming foreign minister in 2017, didn't he put that in the coalition agreement that he wanted to somehow rescind or apologise for that?
He did. I've got the clause here.
Yeah.
Because what happened was all hell broke loose. The resolution goes through. Israel is condemned for its illegal settlements. Israel pulled its ambassador from New Zealand. There was 6 months they were out. Wow. They were absolutely furious with New Zealand for doing that. But then I think Brownlee might have become foreign minister, and he certainly suggested there was unhappiness within the government at the time about the decision. They sort of seemed to suggest or argue that this was somehow made without cabinet approval. Then, as you say, Winston, in his 2017 coalition agreement with Labour, has a clause in there stipulating that the coalition agreement record a cabinet minute regarding the lack of process followed prior to the national-led government sponsorship of UN Security Council Resolution 2334.
Yeah.
Now, that's some detail in your coalition agreement.
I remember that because the other thing that he wanted as foreign minister is a free trade agreement with Russia. That was the other
which we almost had done. If people go back,
I know.
It was almost over the line.
Yeah, I think it was Russia and Kazakhstan, was it?
Belarus, maybe?
Yeah, one of those former Soviet sort of satellite states. But yeah, that I remember that was striking. I remember the first coalition agreement came out, and he'd signed up with Ardern, and you go through the document to see what's in there, and you think this is pretty unusual. That did stick in the memory.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see whether any future New Zealand governments have another go, because you'd imagine sort of 10, 15 years is when you would think about having another go. And New Zealand should, I think, at some point. It's a lot of effort and a lot of money, and you've got to have a permanent mission. You've got your permanent mission, and then you've got to have your Security Council representative who's got a big flash office right next to the UN, so they can run across if there's a crisis and the Security Council needs to meet. But I think New Zealand should. I mean, it's got a proud history, and it can make an influence as a middle country, and we can stick up for middle country views. Quickly, let's just touch very quickly on the issue of peacekeeping. That's the other aspect of the UN I haven't really touched on. We've sent plenty of peacekeepers We can go through, there's Bosnia. We sent 250 at one point, which was a huge effort. East Timor, when you think of East Timor,
that's right. That was 99. We sent a whole battalion, I think,
yes,
into East Timor. Yeah. And
so incredible
we
amount
lost
of
a soldier too. I remember, who died there. But I remember, sending a whole battalion over to East Timor.
And we have, we still have New Zealand peacekeepers out and about, Golan Heights, Africa, various other hotspots, not so many, not huge numbers, but often attachés and people like that are involved. But we still do that, and you'd have to imagine that we would certainly consider any other contributions if that came up. And just finally, we should just note a couple of people who do have David Shearer was a very prominent aid.
That's right, he was
leader for the United Nations. Came into politics on the back of distinguishing himself in the distribution of aid in many third world countries, and was highly regarded.
Yeah, he'd battled some of the hotspots in the world and dealt with some real sort of treachery and violence, but nothing had prepared him for the Labour caucus room.
He got and we should explain because he got rolled in a pretty nasty coup, didn't he?
He did, and to be fair to Labour, I mean, he was not a very successful politician. He's a great guy. I mean, I like David Shearer, and he did a lot of good stuff, but he just wasn't really cut out for politics, was he?
No, he's one of those people when the camera came on, it wasn't a friend to him.
No, that's right.
You yarned to him in the corridor, and he was
flicked the red light on, and it all sort of disappeared, didn't it?
And we should just mention too that Helen Clark did run for the top job at the UN, ran a year-long campaign. By all accounts, did very well and got towards the very near the end. Perhaps we could play a little clip of her arguing why she should be there.
I believe I have the skills and experience necessary to come forward for the position of UN Secretary-General. I'm greatly honoured to have been put forward as the New Zealand candidate with the full support of the government and the full support of the New Zealand Parliament across all political tendencies.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? I mean, because we had some great New Zealanders going for some of these big jobs and just scratching a few of them out. I mean, because Mike Moore headed the WTO, didn't he? I think he had to share it with some guy. I think it was a Thai candidate or something, wasn't it? And then you had, Don McKinnon
was Secretary General of the Commonwealth?
That's right. Yes. And then Helen Clark. And both sides of politics were pretty good at supporting the other, wasn't it? Because John Key was very supportive, as I recall, of Helen Clark's bid, right?
Definitely. No, he gave her 100% support, and she clearly appreciated that. She ran a great campaign. She had Instagram stories. I was at the UN while she was doing that, and I remember going to do an interview with her, and I had to wait a few minutes while she completed her Instagram story.
She loved
it. Was laying out, and she ran a really great social media campaign to try and get that job. In the end, I think perhaps some people thought perhaps because she didn't speak French counted against her. I mean, I don't know if that's the case or not. Most of the time it's geopolitical, isn't it? And who wants what and which groups and all those sort of things. But she clearly distinguished herself there. And let's just finish by coming back to that point you were making earlier on, Guy, about that there has been criticism of the UN. I think some of the criticism has crept in because of its reach. It does a lot more things. We've seen the United Nations Human Rights department, if you like, or the part of it, huge part of the UN, criticising New Zealand over I think it's called UNDRIP, the United Nations
the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People,
Yes, and that has sometimes drawn flack from the likes of Winston Peters and David Seymour, who feel like
I suppose especially when you get countries that have terrible records themselves criticising what on the international stage don't look like, heinous crimes. I suppose that can get up people's nose.
Well, Labour initially did. Helen Clark didn't sign that initially, and then it was John Key who signed up to that, and then it was Winston, and certainly felt that he didn't want it to be binding. So I guess people are going to criticise that, and we know after COVID people criticise the WHO, but in the end, I still the UN Security Council and the apparatus and all the bureaucracy and everything that's there It's all we've got.
Yeah, that's right. It's one of those things, isn't it? Like capitalism and democracy that looks pretty bad until you consider all the other alternatives. And if we didn't have it, you'd be trying to invent it, wouldn't you? I mean, of course, it's not perfect, but at least people are talking and trying to resolve things, I suppose. Certainly not perfect, but it's the case of the great being the enemy of the good, I suppose, in some ways.
Well, that is a good place to leave it. Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching to us, watching us on Context.
And I'm glad you didn't hit me with a pop quiz, because
no,
I sort of heart sank a little bit when you picked that. But maybe you can hit me up next time.
Yeah, all good. All right, we'll catch you later.